Okay, so today we're diving into something I think a lot of our listeners will find really relevant. And it's this idea of how to explain things effectively to someone intelligent. And, obviously, if you're listening to the show, you are someone who appreciates clarity, you appreciate depth, maybe even a bit of unconventional wisdom and how things are explained. So we're not talking about dumbing things down or simplifying for the sake of it. It's really about how do we communicate with a certain level of depth that resonates with someone who really values understanding and insight.
Right. And we're going to be exploring these ideas based on a book called On Becoming an Effective Teacher. And I know the title sounds like it's just about teaching, but really it's grounded in research across all sorts of different learning environments and even just broader human interactions. And it actually reveals a lot of fundamental truths about communication that go way beyond just the classroom. So a lot of these principles are incredibly insightful and they'll help you connect ideas with other people in a way that's really meaningful.
Yeah. And I love that idea of connecting ideas because I think it is a lot more than just like transmitting information. It's how do you really build that shared understanding with someone? So think of this deep dive as like unlocking those secrets to resonant communication with someone who really values understanding and insight, right? So not just like a surface level explanation. So that's kind of our mission today, is to extract those key principles. And one of the first things that the book really emphasizes is this idea of authenticity and genuineness. It seems so fundamental, right? But I think when you're talking to someone intelligent, the implications of that are really quite profound.
Yeah, and one thing that's really interesting here is the fact that intelligent people can often perceive when someone is being disingenuous or if their understanding of something is only superficial. And Carl Rogers, who's a psychologist whose work is cited quite a bit in the book, he emphasizes this idea of genuineness or what he calls congruence as being crucial for effective relationships. And I think that applies even more so to communication. And this is because someone with a really sharp mind, they're going to rely on things like subtle cues, logical consistency, and even their own existing knowledge base to kind of assess the validity and the authenticity of what they're hearing. So any hint of pretense or, fakeness is going to be a huge barrier.
Yeah. It's like they have this built-in truth detector, right? And one thing I thought was really insightful in the book is this distinction that they make between status authority, so, relying on a title or a position versus natural authority. And I think it made sense that someone who's really intellectually capable isn't going to be easily swayed by just your status.
Yeah.
What really earns their attention and respect is this idea of natural authority, which comes from demonstrating a genuine grasp of the subject, a willingness to learn and explore together, and just a passion for what you're talking about.
Absolutely, and that's a great point because, an intelligent listener isn't necessarily looking for someone who claims to be this ultimate authority on a subject. In fact, Rogers points out that, trying to be perfect or present yourself as perfect can actually be really counterproductive. And there's a great quote in the book that I think really sums this up. It says, "Who wants a perfect teacher? A perfect teacher is phony." And, if you apply that to this context of explaining something to someone intelligent, being willing to acknowledge the limits of your knowledge, even saying something like, "That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure, but we could explore it together." That actually builds a lot more credibility than trying to bluff or, present this flawless and potentially less genuine explanation because it shows intellectual honesty.
Totally. It's like it's much more about being a fellow explorer rather than this distant lecturer who's just transmitting information.
Mm.
And another really critical aspect that the book highlights, especially in the context of learning, is this idea of empathy and truly understanding the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
So how does that kind of play out when you're trying to explain something to someone intelligent?
Well, effective communication, it's not a one-way street, right? It's not just about transmitting information. And research actually consistently shows the huge impact that empathy has in educational settings. And I think this translates to any interaction, but especially with intelligent individuals, because to really connect with someone, you need to think about what their existing knowledge framework is, what their potential biases might be. We all have them, right? And how they might be approaching the topic. So it's really about understanding the landscape of their mind before you try to navigate it with your explanation.
Yeah, it's like you have to know your audience, even when your audience is just one person,
Hmm.
right? And the book also talks about this idea of listening more deeply. So it's not just about what they're saying on the surface level, it's trying to understand the underlying questions or assumptions that they might be making, or even the perspectives that they might not be voicing explicitly.
Exactly. And Roger's own experiences that he shares in the book really highlight this profound impact of being heard without judgment or evaluation, and when you're explaining a complex idea to someone intelligent, creating that space for them where they feel like their thoughts, their questions are genuinely valued, even if they might differ from your own initially. That can really influence how receptive they are to what you're trying to convey because it fosters this environment of intellectual safety and encourages them to really engage with the topic.
Yeah, it's like it's real dialogue, right? It's not just a presentation. It's like you're actually engaging in this exchange of ideas.
Hmm.
And understanding can emerge kind of organically through that process. And speaking of process, one thing that the book really underscores is the importance of feedback. And I think that's something that might seem really obvious, but it's so vital when you're trying to explain something effectively.
Right. And what's fascinating is that the research actually suggests that feedback is a huge driver of learning and understanding. And so when you're trying to explain something complicated, how do you know if the other person is actually getting it right? So giving them opportunities to ask questions to seek clarification from you. This isn't just a formality. This is really essential for making sure that they're building a solid understanding.
It's like a sense check, right? And you can course correct along the way. And the book also points out the value of positive feedback. It's not just about correcting misunderstandings. It's also about acknowledging when someone does understand something, because that can be really reinforcing and encourage them to delve deeper into the topic.
Totally. It validates their understanding and makes them want to engage more. And then, the book kind of transitions to this idea of shifting the focus from just the content of what you're explaining to the process and the broader context surrounding it. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because the book talks about effective teachers and, by extension, effective communicators with intelligent people being more process-oriented rather than just
Okay.
content-oriented. So what does that distinction actually mean, when you're trying to explain something?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that an intelligent mind often wants to understand the how and the why behind something, not just the what. They're going to be interested in the underlying mechanisms, the logic, the connections to other ideas. So if you just present a bunch of facts or conclusions without explaining the reasoning or the process of how you got there, it can leave them feeling kind of intellectually unsatisfied. Whereas if you explain the process, like the methodology, the evidence, how you arrived at your conclusions, that's going to be much more engaging and lead to a deeper understanding.
That makes sense. Like you're giving them the tools, right? Not just the finished product. And the book uses this really compelling analogy of President Kennedy's man on the moon goal.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the content of landing on the moon. It was about creating this context of ambition and challenge that inspired people to come up with innovative solutions.
Exactly. And by framing that objective within a larger context, it empowered people to contribute their expertise and find those creative solutions. So when you're explaining something to someone smart, think about how you can frame it within a broader context or a compelling narrative that's going to spark their curiosity and make them want to actively participate in understanding it.
Right. So it's less about giving a lecture and more about facilitating a journey of discovery. And
Hmm.
the book talks about this concept of the teacher being a facilitator rather than this, sage on the stage.
Yeah, and what's so insightful about that is this idea of the explainer acting as a catalyst or a facilitator, someone who doesn't necessarily have all the answers, but who guides the process of discovery. Someone who poses thought-provoking questions and helps the other person construct their own understanding.
Yeah, it's like you're providing the scaffolding, but allowing them to build the structure themselves. And there's this great quote from Lao Tzu that the book mentions about leadership. It says, when his work is all done and his mission accomplished, then the people will all say, we did this ourselves. And I think that's such a powerful metaphor for explaining something. You want the other person to feel that sense of ownership over the understanding that they've gained, rather than just feeling like they've received information passively.
Exactly, because intelligent individuals often have this really strong drive for intellectual autonomy, and by facilitating their discovery, you're respecting their cognitive abilities and fostering a more meaningful and lasting understanding. It's empowering them, right? And then the book introduces this element of values and beliefs, especially when it's talking about Roger's concept of the man of tomorrow, or, we might say the person of today. So how does that kind of tie into all of this?
Well, Rogers saw this new man as someone who really values authenticity and who just completely rejects pretense. And, intelligent individuals, they tend to be very attuned to underlying values, and they appreciate it when someone is communicating from a place of genuine conviction. It's not just about reciting facts. It's about speaking from a place of real understanding and belief.
It's like the integrity of the message has to align with the integrity of the messenger, right? And the book kind of contrasts this new man with more traditional or rigid systems. And it seems like those who really value authenticity might end up questioning or challenging those established norms.
Right, and that kind of leads to a consideration of the potential challenges that someone who thinks differently might face.
Hmm.
Does this lead to feelings of isolation or alienation?
Uh-huh.
That's a really good point, because if you're operating on a different intellectual plane or you have different values, it could definitely make you feel disconnected from others.
Yeah, and the book makes this distinction between loneliness and aloneness, So while an intelligent person might experience periods of aloneness in their perspectives, what's really important is the ability to connect authentically with even just a few like-minded individuals who share those core values of seeking truth and understanding. Those connections are so vital for providing a sense of belonging and preventing that descent into despair that loneliness can bring. So even though this person of today might not always fit neatly into conventional structures, the ability to connect deeply and authentically is still essential.
It's about the quality of the connections, not just the quantity, right? So we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's kind of summarize some of the key takeaways.
Absolutely. So, to explain something effectively to someone intelligent, remember to prioritize authenticity and genuineness above all else. Really try to cultivate empathy to understand their existing knowledge and perspective, value their feedback as a crucial part of the communication process. Shift your focus from just delivering content to explaining the process in the broader context. Act as a facilitator rather than a lecturer. And make sure you're grounding your communication in genuine values and conviction.
Those are some incredibly valuable insights, and I think for all of our listeners out there, as you're navigating these conversations, especially with people whose intellect you really respect, think about how you can consciously apply these principles to really elevate your communication and build deeper, more meaningful connections, because it's about more than just conveying information. It's about sparking understanding and creating those intellectual connections. So as you go about your day-to-day, think about a recent interaction you've had maybe where these insights could have shifted the dynamic. How could you have approached it differently? And how can you integrate these principles into your future exchanges with those sharp minds?
Food for thought.
Exactly. All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.